It seems to be 6 o'clock, so I'll get started if that's all right. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Right. This is actually the first meeting of the Planning Policy and Local Plan Committee, because we've changed the name of the committee and the delegated powers at our last council meeting, and we did that with immediate effect. So although the agenda, which had been obviously printed beforehand, states Local Plan Committee, it's actually Planning Policy and Local Plan, although we don't have any planning policy business tonight. I'm still quite excited about it. Let's move on with the agenda. We have got apologies. I've got apologies from Councillors Platt, Bray and Carlo Guglielmi, and Councillor Coley, welcome, Alan, is substituting for Carlo this evening. Have we got any other apologies?
I will have to say that I don't think Alex is going to arrive.
Oh, right.
I know I couldn't substitute.
Really? Oh, okay. Okay. Well, thanks anyway. Right. Minutes of the last meeting. Are we happy that I sign those?
So moved, Chairman.
Yeah. Is that agreed? Yeah. Thank you very much. I'll sign those. Declarations of interest. Members are invited to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests or personal interests and the nature of it in relation to any item on the agenda. I don't want to get my wallet out. I was looking for a pen. Thank you. Sorry. Item 4, questions on notice. There are none. Item 5, public speaking. We do currently allow people to make statements without notice, and we have got one. We have got Bill Marshall, who wants to speak to both items on the agenda, A1 and A2. Bill, if you'd like to come to the microphone, I think you probably know what to do. Over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. The Local Plan Committee tonight are being asked to agree for the Local Plan Development Scheme to be published, and part of this local development scheme is a process of community involvement. And as you can see behind us here, there's not many members of the community here taking part in this process. So I think we failed there. This is a special meeting, an important special meeting. So it is a big failure in not communicating with the community. On Friday the 18th, Richard Bailey of the North Essex Garden Communities actually said that there had to be more community involvement with the garden community scheme, which was lacking in the first stages of the process back in 2016. So something we've got to work on. Now the timescales in the local, in Appendix 1 I think it is, on page 25, for the Section 1 and Section 2 adoptions are adoption winter 2021. And this is far too ambitious given the track record that we've had so far, and with the inspector and all of his points he has raised. And so I would ask that you carefully consider what's before you and dig deep into the figures and the dates. That's it. Thank you very much. I don't need to talk on number 2. Okay. Thank you.
For the benefit of the record, I just declare that the interest that I am a director of North Essex Garden Communities Limited. Okay, then without further ado, really, we can move on to A1. Daniel. Sorry, Daniel.
No, sorry,
You're not? I thought you wanted to speak. You had your pen poised in a meaningful way.
You're going to be doing this next.
You fooled me. Next item is A1 Local Development Scheme. Gary.
Thank you, Chairman. Good evening, members. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, this report starts on page 13. It's the Local Development Scheme. The purpose of this report is to get your approval, please, for the Local Development Scheme, which essentially sets out the timetable and the work programme for local plan and associated planning documents. Now, the key area really to understand is that we've had to adjust the timetable for completing the local plan because, as you are aware, the inspector had concerns about Section 1 of the local plan when we had the examination, and we have taken the decision to produce further evidence in order to address those concerns, and that takes time. So the revised timetable, which is set out on the executive summary of the report, but also within the document, the Appendix 1 itself, and Mr. Marshall has already alluded to it, is that we would reconvene the examination of Section 1 local plan in the autumn of this year. Now that follows your approval of the new evidence that is being produced and consultation upon that evidence. So that will take place, and community involvement, before the information goes to the inspector. We would then expect to hear back from the inspector, hopefully this time with a positive news about the local plan, by the end of this year. And so the time scales for adopting the local plan is that we would want both Section 1 and Section 2 of the local plan to be adopted winter 2020-21, as Mr. Marshall explained. But there is the potential that Section 1 of the plan could be adopted separately in spring 2020, formally adopted by the three authorities, and then Section 2 would follow. So essentially the timetable we're looking at here is that we reconvene the examination of Section 1 in the autumn. We get the inspector's confirmation that it's okay by the end of the year. Then we would proceed to examination of the Section 2 local plan in the middle part of next year, 2020, with a view of getting the inspector's final letters on Section 2 and being able to adopt the whole local plan winter 2020-21. This timetable is entirely consistent with that being put forward to the respective committees of the other two councils. And the recommendation, which is on page 14 of your agenda, is that the Local Plan Committee approves the local development scheme, which is attached as Appendix 1, and agrees to its publication on the Council's website. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Gary. That's a very succinct and meaningful explanation of where we're at. Any comments from anyone? Yeah, go on, Mike.
Gary, was there any reason why the independent examination for Section 2 is lagging quite considerably behind Section 1? Is there no way this could be in line, or what's preventing that from being aligned? That would be my first question.
Yep. Well, Section 1 has to be confirmed as being sound before the examination of Section 2 can take place, because there are elements of that Section 1 to do with the number of houses that need to be built, the amount of employment land that needs to be constructed, that need to be formally confirmed before we know that our Section 2 is fine and we can proceed to that examination. Now, for whatever reason, if there were significant changes to Section 1 that might have a knock-on effect to Section 2, then we'd have to deal with those changes before we had the examination of Section 2. So there is likely to be a period of time where we might have to consider some adjustments to Section 2. But ultimately, the timetable for when the examination actually commences for Section 2 is in the hands of the Planning Inspectorate, and that is a best estimate based on the general timescales that you see for the preparation of local plans. It's not impossible that it could be done earlier, but it very much depends on how quickly we get Section 1 resolved, and basically we are using a generally accepted rule of thumb for how long it takes to go from one part of the local plan to the next part.
Any other questions, Mike? No, that's fine, thanks. Okay. I'll take a move if somebody wants to move the recommendation on page 14.
I'll move.
Yeah, Nick's moved it. Go on, Dan seconded it. Okay, well that is the recommendation. It's printed there on page 14 that we approve the local development scheme and agree the publication on the website. Are we happy to do that? All agreed?
Agreed.
That's agreed.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sooner the better.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, so the next item, again, is in the capable hands of Gary Guyver.
Thank you, Chairman. Something slightly different. From time to time, the government proposes changes to the planning system that affect both the sort of legislation and the regulations behind the planning system. And this latest proposal really reflects the government's aims to assist the development of the high streets and to ensure their protection into the future, to assist in the delivery of housing, which has been a key aim of government for a very long period of time. They're the key aims. So what's been put forward here is the government's proposals for changes to the system. Part of it is to do with the permitted development rights and use classes, and very quickly, permitted development rights essentially are what someone can do without needing to have to apply for planning permission. So currently it covers a whole range of things, extensions to properties of a certain size, what you can reuse certain buildings for, and also the use class order. And those that aren't familiar with that is different types of activity are categorised within different use classes. So you have, for example, A1 being retail use, B1 being office use, C3 being residential use. And there are certain changes that can be done between those use classes without the need for planning permission. And really this government proposal looks at those two areas. So if I just run very quickly through some of the concepts, the first range of proposed changes is to make it more flexible for town centre uses to be able to change from one to another. So for example, these changes would make it easier for a retail unit to change to a restaurant, for example, or for a retail unit to change to a community use. And these changes are being put in place really in recognition that retail is declining on the high street, yet there are other uses that can contribute positively in town centres. And rather than those businesses having to apply for planning permission every time they wanted to make a change, these changes to the system would allow them to change between the uses without planning permission. There's also a series of changes that are aimed at building more houses. They include being able to extend properties upwards to construct new homes within the empty space above shops or above existing houses without the need to apply for planning permission. Whereas at the moment, if you wanted to build flats above a shop within over a certain number, you would have to apply for permission. What these changes would allow is potentially someone to build apartments above a shop no higher than 5 additional stories, but the likelihood is that actually they would be restricted to the prevailing height of existing property within that terrace of properties. So it would be filling in logical gaps rather than plonking a great big tower block in the middle of in a row of shops. Yes, so tower blocks in Connaught Avenue I don't think would be a concern with these changes. Other changes that are being suggested aren't so relevant to the tendering district and relate to being able to provide phone boxes without planning permission and place adverts on them. And really that's mainly a problem for London. because in London they've had an issue where people or companies have been installing phone boxes without really any intention of putting a phone in them, just so they can use the advertising space on those phone boxes and make revenue through those means. So that's actually something that the government want to tighten up on rather than relax. Vehicular charging points, that's another area. Obviously, we want to encourage the use of electric cars in the future. At the moment, you can install an electric charging point within an off-street car park to a height of 1.6 metres. These relaxations would allow you to have one that is higher at 2.3 metres, because the new technology dictates that actually a bigger unit is going to be required in the future. So they could be bigger under these new rules. There are also proposals here where at the moment, well, for some time now, there has been a temporary period of time. It was going to be a 3-year period in which you could build an 8-metre extension behind your property. Whereas before it was always a 3-metre extension, and for a temporary period of time it's been an 8-metre extension. And that came about after the downturn to try and encourage the building industry to get going and to encourage people to spend money on extensions. The proposal here is to make that permanent. So they are the main changes to the planning system. Also within this document, there are proposals to make it easier for local authorities to dispose of their own land, because at the moment there is a duty for councils, if they're disposing of land, to get the best value for that land. And sometimes that can be an issue if what you're trying to achieve is something that has a greater good for the community. Selling it off for the best price is not always the best thing to achieve a greater good. What these changes would do would allow a larger number of disposals to take place without needing to involve the Secretary of State. Because at the moment, if a council wants to dispose of a piece of council-owned land that is not achieving best value, it has to go through the Secretary of State. Whereas this would actually give councils a bit more power to make that decision themselves. There's a whole section on canals and rivers which aren't relevant to our district. But there's also a section on compulsory purchase orders, which is the ability to actually acquire land using a compulsory purchase order for major infrastructure works or major development. It's a very simple change that is being suggested here, because councils have compulsory purchase powers, the government has compulsory purchase powers, and development corporations have compulsory purchase powers. So if you have a formal development corporation that is perhaps involved in the construction of major settlements, perhaps garden communities, they would have powers to acquire land to be able to do that development. The government guidance changed a while back, but neglected to cover the fact that development corporations had CPO powers, and I think all the government are doing really is putting that right by ensuring that development corporations are clearly able to use compulsory purchase powers. So essentially, what has been done is a response has been drafted to these consultation proposals, and that is attached as an appendix to this report. And that had to be sent off to the government by the deadline, which unfortunately fell between committee meetings. So it wasn't possible to bring these before you for a decision beforehand. But the chairman of the committee has seen these responses before we put them out. And in general terms, those changes aimed at supporting the high street and town centres, officers have been generally supportive, subject to certain caveats about how much control the council might retain over certain changes of use or developments. In terms of extending properties upwards, we've generally taken a relatively cautious approach, because what you wouldn't want is the scenario that Councillor Turner alluded to, where you've got huge great tower blocks popping up out of the middle of nowhere where they might not be appropriate. So with caveats, there's some support for being able to build above shops, but there ought to be a level of control that the authority can retain in considering those proposals. In terms of more flexibility to dispose of local authority land for the greater good of the community, we've written in support of that. And in terms of the new town development corporation rights to use compulsory purchase powers, bearing in mind our aspirations for garden communities, we've written in support of that, and we've written in support of that jointly with our fellow councils of Braintree and Colchester. If we turn to the recommendation, which is page 36, I'm asking the committee please to note the content of this report, which includes the consultation response, which was previously the subject of consultation and agreement with the chairman of the committee, and to note that our response to these government proposals was submitted to the government on the 14th of January. And before I finish, we don't have any time scales or indication from the government as to when they're likely to implement these changes, but we would expect that, having considered all of the various comments from the councils, we would expect something probably this summer.
So, to clarify there, in case you missed it, Gary set out an excellent presentation of some very interesting discussion points there and got us all thinking, and then casually slid in at the end there that we've already made this decision. It's already gone off, and it's all down to me because I agreed it. So we now have the opportunity of noting.
Do I have a movement
noting
for refusing?
No, well, you know, there's a lot of work's gone into this response, and I'm grateful to Gary and his colleagues for the work they did. I think, you know, I think who knows what notice government will take to what we've said. I think if lots of other authorities make similar comments, I expect they probably will. There's some quite interesting points in there. These consultations do come around every now and again, as Gary said at the beginning, and it is worth engaging with them and getting stuck in. Unfortunately for this one, it did come between meetings, so I have been in discussion with Gary and confirmed it. So I think it would actually be better if the recommendation, and I'm happy to move it myself, that instead of saying we'd simply note it and we agree, and we support the contents of the report, to say that we actually support the fact that we've sent those responses back to government. Are we happy with that? If anyone wants to comment further on any of the points in there, because there was some quite interesting topics of conversation, I'm happy to have that conversation. As I say, we are now the Planning Policy and Local Plan Committee, so that is going to be, I think, a very interesting sort of slight diversion for us to get our teeth into some planning policy issues, rather than simply just sort of focusing constantly on the local plan. Hopefully the local plan will be put to bed at some point in the not too distant future, as we've just had the timetable outlined, and we'll be able to move on to the sunny uplit pastures of a new dawn, working on the next local plan, presumably. We seriously will have to start working on the next local plan, but the planning policy aspect, I think there's lots of things. Lots of members have already come up with little policies that, you know, could help to change our planning regime in this district for the better, and put the marker down that we want this to be the best planning regime in the country. Don't see why we shouldn't aspire to the best. Yeah. So I moved that recommendation as printed with the additional words. Tanya seconded it. Thank you, Tanya. Any comments, anyone? Are we happy to agree that then? Agreed. Right, okay. That is... Well, my bit was quite easy, to be honest, Tanya. I just did a bit of reading. But he did the legwork, trust me. That is it. We've got enough time to get home and watch the votes in Parliament. Yeah, go on, Nick, you wanted to say something? Hide in a bunker somewhere until it's all over. Nick wanted to say something. Anyway.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yes, as we're now Local Plan and Policy Committee, I thought I'd kick the ball rolling,
As I read through the papers this week, I suddenly thought one of the things that I've always aspired to and pushed it very hard at both town level and at and our committee level here is about the quality of the housing we're getting, the quality of the size. And there's one thing the chairman and I have spoken over for many years, that you can't swing a cat in some of the modern homes, let alone even get something as simple as a wardrobe or a bedside table in. And I think this is appalling. We're just leaving a lot of trouble for our succeeders, our successors. And one of the things I was looking through, I noticed, I thought I'd look up the London Standard. Neil, and many, many years ago, came up with the Parker Morris, which I'd completely forgotten about, which was set out in 1961 to be the minimum standards for council housing, which was very much second class in those days. And that was the minimum standards. They then revised it in 68 and further in 71 to make it slightly larger. And I've actually had major developers in front of us when we've had pre-planning meetings where they've just laughed in my face when I've suggested, are there rooms up to the minimum standards of Parker Morris? And they just laugh at you. And one of the things that took it on further was some of our friends, well, my friend anyway, Mr. Boris Johnson, MP, when he was Mayor of London, and he came up with a better standard than the last Parker Morris and called it the London Standard. And I would like us to seriously consider adopting this standard or something, if there's anything better than that, come forward for future discussions by this committee.
Okay, this is a good